Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode. All right. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Stef.
Hello, everybody. Today we're talking about trauma. And just prior to hitting record, I brought something up to Sarah and she had this reaction. And she's like, well, I'll talk about it on the podcast. So I said, well, I want to find a more proper definition for the difference between being trauma-informed and being trauma-aware. And Sarah had this reaction, like, I got a lot to say about that, and then bit her lip and got this smirk, and I don't know why. So can you please share?
Oh, because the word trauma-informed is one that gets bandied around a lot, particularly in the psychotherapy world, about therapists looking for a trauma-informed therapist. It's a real, to me, it's like become this sort of buzz phrase.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean to you? First of all, when you hear that term, trauma-informed practitioner, for example, what is it you're expecting that person to have or be?
A training in, like a more focused training in trauma.
All it really means is that somebody has a framework to think about trauma. And before this episode, when I was trying to find a definition, I put into Google, what is trauma or something? And then it had, under all these little subheadings you get, it had the 3 types of trauma. Then it had the 4 types of trauma. And then it had 2 levels of trauma. Trauma is one of these words that it's so big and means so many different things to different people, because there's clinical definitions, there's like how we might use it colloquially or conversationally, all of that, that it's one of those words that is losing meaning for me. And it feels like a buzzword.
It is. And I think that my own opinion of the word has changed being a coach, because there's so much that I have learned from clients who have significant histories of trauma that gave me this insight into how much I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a difference between knowing you don't know something and knowing, you know what I mean? So
Yes.
I would call myself trauma aware, because I'm aware that there's a lot I don't know and that there's things I'm not trained in. Whereas before, I don't know that I would have even known to the extent to which I didn't know things about it. This is why I'm in a 3-year certification program for somatic experiencing, which is a trauma-informed practice. So my goal is to, I'm so intrigued by trauma and the way that this shows up in so much of disordered eating and body image and eating disorders, that it's important for me. I feel responsible to be trauma-informed. But yes, it's used. I think sometimes people don't, I like to think I use it appropriately. I think at one time in my life, I didn't know how I was really using it.
Yeah.
To what degree this mattered.
And where's the line where someone calls themselves trauma-informed? And the word informed is like somebody's told you some stuff. You've been informed by somebody else that this is what this thing is, or this is a way of thinking about it. So somebody can do a 1-day workshop, somebody can read a book and technically be trauma-informed, because there's no level, there's no way of really making that term mean anything. And so people just use trauma as well, the word itself, trauma, in so many different ways. I suppose we need to have a little talk, you and me, Stef, we need to have a talk about how we're using trauma in this conversation so that it makes sense to people and that that it's useful for people. I like Gabor Mate's stuff. So he talks a lot about trauma and addiction as well as a big part of his work. And I like the way that he talks about it. Do you have a way that you think about that word?
So I'm come from the Peter Levine, his way, his angle. So more of the nervous system, the somatic experience of trauma, and how that lives in the body. And that's the angle through which I understand it and first understood it and first experienced it and made sense of it for myself. And we can also talk about the difference between capital T trauma and lowercase t trauma.
Which I don't think is far off how Gabor talks about it at all. So he talks about it in terms of it's not about what happened to you, it's about what happened inside you.
Yeah.
And he also really stresses that trauma can also be about what didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we think of trauma, we often think of the big things.
The
We think of
event.
violence. We think of
Mm.
sexual assault. We think of all these kinds of really dramatic events, which are traumatic events. But trauma is something that happens internally, is how I think of it, which absolutely seems to be along the same thread as what you're
Yeah.
talking about with the nervous system.
Right. What's trauma to one person may not be to another. It depends on how our systems are able to take in what's going on and make sense of it and process it. So, in my own experience, I have not had capital T trauma, what I would call that, as far as I have not been sexually assaulted or physically abused or in a devastating car accident or something like that. That's more clear. But I've always been very sensitive and very emotionally attuned. And in my growing up for me, there was emotional misattunement in that, and not to blame, right? So my mom did not know what to do with my emotions. My mom's very practical and logical, or, just rational woman, and doesn't have like a template for understanding the range with which I experience emotions from a very young age. I remember being really young. I remember standing in my mom's like bathroom vanity area. I remember the shirt I was wearing. I must have been 6, 5, 6, and thinking about how large the world was and how insignificant. I didn't have that word, but just like thinking of how small I am and what does this all mean? I remember having this moment
Wow.
of that and being like, wow, we are just small, like, and feeling this existential sense of loneliness at that age. That's the first memory I had of that. And I remember talking to my mom, but she was like, "What are you sending in the mirror?" Like there was no one to talk to. And I think my dad had a lot more emotional capacity, but he did not approve of his own. So he reined it in through me. So anytime that I would present big feelings, he was like, "No, no, 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 no," like that. And he would minimize. And, because I think that's what now in retrospect, seeing like that is what he was doing to himself. So a lot of this I was alone with. And I also grew up in a volatile, it's sort of like emotionally charged household in that there's a lot of yelling, not to be stereotypical, but we were Italian and there was a lot of loud, a lot of volume. And it overwhelmed me because I think I had a lot of sensory sensitivity. And there was arguing and there was fighting and there was chaos. And I remember retreating into myself. I remember the point at which I shut off, right? So I remember hearing it coming and being like, "Oh no," which is still what my anxiety does now. It's like, "Oh no." And getting so attuned to everybody and being like, "Oh God, how do I manage everybody here so that we don't clash, so that this doesn't turn into what I know it could turn into?" And then at some point it would get too big and I would go to my room and I would just, I remember the volume like ringing in my ears and I would just go in. Those were moments for me of, my system couldn't process all that and couldn't handle all that. And I was too little. Um, what was the question?
We were just talking about what it was, I think, at that point. But I suppose
Oh, no, I know. So to this day, I still feel that in my system when things that are kind of innocuous on the outside remind my body of that. So when someone starts to get upset, particularly still my dad, who doesn't behave that way anymore, but when he starts to get upset about something, I am like, I feel it in me in the same way I did then. And it's in the body. So a lot of my own work around this has been taking that energy and then instead of locking it in and freezing, it's like moving it through and like actually processing this as energy because I can feel it living in there. It feels like energy that gets trapped. And so I'm trying to process that more. I think this happens intellectually and somatically. I don't think it's just somatically. Um, but I've done a lot of that intellectual work already. And just I think the body stuff is where it is still coming out. But so much of my roadmap in my brain is based on a lot of that. So I've learned to be really vigilant. I've learned to be really attuned. Um, and I've learned how to protect and defend. And there's certain signals I get from the environment that are like, nope, nope, nope. And I will retreat. And I always considered those pathologies of mine, but I see them now. I'm kind of like, oh, I see what that is. I know what that is. That's part of the processing. And that was part of my eating disorder, that I can understand that now. And there's people I work with who have much, much broader, much more complex cases of trauma from years and years and years of things like neglect, shame, physical or sexual abuse, but also emotional abuse. Um, that is still living in there, unprocessed, because the way you got through it at such a young age usually was just you didn't have the resources to get through it. So you just sort of locked it in and you froze there. And a lot of times I hear that a lot from people who will say, I feel like I'm still a child. I feel like I'm reacting like a child, or I feel like I'm still an adolescent, but I'm, so and so years old. And why am I still reacting this way? And I think that is a lot of where the trauma shows up, and how food can become something that pushes a lot of that down, distracts, numbs. It's a way of dissociating. And this is how I think a lot of times food is showing up in that eating disorder intersection.
Mm. The images that were coming into my mind when you were talking was, so the word trauma comes from the Greek word wound.
Mm.
So I was imagining like all this, the chaos that was going on, almost like each one of them just being like a lash, like you were just being lashed, like with a whip or something. And then I was imagining like the wounds that then open up because of that experience. And I think what almost seems to happen innately with so many of us is then we're ashamed of these wounds, and we have to cover them up because we shouldn't have been wounded. Like we should have been stronger and more robust. And we put these clothes on, whether it's an eating disorder, whatever it might be, like we cover it up. And actually, like what the wounds need to heal is to come out into the air, right? They need sort of exposure and light and an opportunity to heal, and what that looks like. When you're talking about doing the somatic work, if this feels okay to share, what does that actually look like at the somatic level for you, for your body to work through some of this stuff that's been kind of stored in there?
So you know how we've talked before about my comfort with anger?
Mhm.
Um, I have so much, right? So I think at a young age, because anger was freely expressed, I think I had a lot of it in those moments, right? I also want to just say, as a parent, I appreciate that what I was experiencing as a child was different, perhaps, than my parents might have seen it. Because sometimes my child will come to me and say something, and I have this immediate reaction of, That's no big deal." And I remember, like, oh, yeah, that's probably what my parents thought too. Like, I can understand that now. I can understand from an adult perspective that that's not a big deal. But I have more awareness, and I think that's by nature of this generation. My parents didn't have that. We didn't talk about trauma like
Mhm.
that. That was something for like post-war veterans, you know? Um, they wouldn't have known that impact on me. And so I can understand now why what to me was a really big deal was being dismissed and not attended to. But to a parent, they might not have seen that. So that's why I think, like, I don't have blame there in that regard. Um, but how this presents now is that I have the same level of anger come up in response to situations that remind me of being dismissed, misunderstood, not taken seriously, called things, and other sources of triggers, right? So anytime that exists in my world now, I get anger. And so what I've noticed through somatic work is noticing how often that's actually happening, and how my brain wants to be like, no, 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 get down, which used to happen through food. And then I think once I actually when the food started to heal, I started to notice this a lot more, because then I didn't have a tool with which to push it down. It was rising a lot. I was like, why am I always so angry? And then I started to feel what that felt like. And it is like this surge from my stomach that comes up my chest and up to my throat, and then my ears pulse, and see what I'm doing? Like, I get this upper body movement that starts to come out, and my voice wants to get loud. And so I notice that as it's happening, and I will, I'll want to sing a lot. I noticed my husband used to laugh because he's like, as soon as we started having kids, you started singing all over the place. Um, my stress. So I would be like, oh, and every time I get anxious, I would sing it through. And it was just this funny thing. But now I'm like, oh, singing is actually a way that we process, because it reverberates in the vagus nerve, which is part of our regulation system. So I'll want to do that, but I'll also sometimes just want to like yell and rah. So I'll often have like grunts and groans. And I've talked about that with body image where I would look at my body and go, ugh. That's part of it. Like there's this anger that just, and so it's been a way of finding more productive ways to get it out vocally for me. And also, vocally is a big one for me, but also through movement in my upper body to kind of be like, see, I just sighed. And that's kind of one of the hallmarks. Okay, my system, and like it's moving out. I'm not trapping it in here and telling it to go back down. I'm like, it's getting expressed intentionally. And I think the intention has been such a game-changing thing because I think I used to do these things and I don't know, it didn't have the same effect as it does now that I know. And I'm kind of like, yes, I hear you, get out, let's get out. It's this intentional process and this awareness and kind of like it's okay for you to be here. Move, let's express you. That calms me.
Mhm. I always think anger, like it wants to be heard. So your anger, this experience of anger, like really, what does it want to say?
Well, it depends on what's going on.
Beyond the consequence, beyond what's actually going on in this moment,
Yeah.
in the moment, that when there's
I
something
want to
that's
say I'm
triggered it.
here.
Yes.
I'm here.
Yes.
That was the first thing that just came to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So then I wonder then if your anger is likely to be triggered when the perception is that people are treating you like you're not here.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And it happens with like my kids when my kids don't listen to me. When I have a conversation with my daughter who's 11 now, so she's getting to an age where we're having productive conversations. And this happened the other day. We had this talk at night about some of the things going on. You know, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to work on this, and you work on this, and we had this whole moment. And the next day, it was like we never had that conversation, and I felt myself get triggered so fast. And it's like my daughter's safe. My daughter is not an, you know,
A threat.
but my body doesn't know. My body is like, here's someone who doesn't think you're here, like who doesn't listen to you, like you don't matter here, like everything that. I can see. So things like that all the time. And these things happen all the time because there's always moments I find that this happens, whether it's work related. I mean, there's so many situations in life in which it's not vindictive. It's not an attack on me. It's just simply the byproduct of life sometimes that we're not always heard or seen, or we are misunderstood, or we're not, whatever. Like that, it happens. It happens so much. But until I process this, it's going to keep doing that. And I'm going to keep being so easily triggered because my body is like, no, that's old. That's old. And it's like, no, it's not. We can move this anger out and I need to process this. That's old. So.
Yeah.
But I can feel how food, it's just so easy to be like, push that down, numb that out.
I think that's really useful, what you've shared there, particularly around the anger side of things. There's so much written, particularly psychoanalytically, around something like binging and anger, particularly as well, like with bulimia, that kind of expulsion of that, like
Yes.
what goes on in that cycle. And you've talked about that before, like with your binging, almost like standing up for yourself.
Yeah.
As a way of going, like, I am here.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all have these relational wounds, if you like, the times when we were missed and when things didn't feel safe when we were younger, and it absolutely being about how we experienced them more than what it was. I think my pattern as a result of my experience, if I think about it in terms of like a trauma responses being perhaps a bit maladaptive, they're not quite in the here and now, right? They're so informed by the past. Mine is to run or collapse. And the thing that would trigger that in me is if I feel like somebody's withdrawing, I just want to get out of there. I don't move closer. So this was a lot of the work that I did in therapy around, because often it would be a perception, like your experience with your daughter. It's not really happening, but in that moment, your body's telling you it is happening. And I had these moments of like, okay, and moving closer in those moments, and then realizing it was never what I thought it was. You know?
Yeah.
And having an escape hatch as well, because a big part of, without going into too much detail, like around my childhood fear and wound is about being trapped. I need an escape hatch. I need to know it's there. And if I know it's there, it's okay. I don't need to use it. And so I sometimes find even when I commit myself to something, I have this feeling in me where I feel that sense of trapped, and I have to reassure myself. I was like, you can not do this thing. Almost whatever it is, you can get out of it, whether it's even a rental agreement on a flat or something like that. You can get out of it. There are consequences to that. And when I reassure myself, quite often, I still want to choose that thing because it's not about the thing. I do often want to do the thing. Occasionally, it's like, actually, no, I need to get out of this. But 9 times out of 10.
Yeah.
So I'm always doing that. The reassurance that my nervous system needs is that you can leave, you can get out if you need to. And I need to know that that's there in order for my body to feel safe to stay, is to know it can leave.
Absolutely. And safety, I think, is the key word. That's what we're looking for, is the body needs to feel safe, which, how do you experience the difference, even when you're talking about that, the feeling of not having an escape hatch? What does that do? How do you know you're in a place of versus knowing you have that plan B or that way out? How does safety feel?
Well, it's a reassurance. So I think it's one of the reasons why I was never. There are some people who struggle with binge eating, disorders eating, who are quite good at dieting when they get into that dieting mindset. It all falls apart, but they can have times when they're good at dieting. I think for me, the sense of dieting or any kind of food restriction, or even just trying to create some boundaries around food, felt like control and felt like being trapped.
Yeah.
So for me, binge eating was often about this bursting free, if you like, more than a sense of feeling that anger. It was this bursting free. And that's why the constant reassurance, and that's why even telling myself now, I can still binge one day. It's fine. It could happen. I don't say it's never going to happen again, because that almost, not so much now saying it here, but it can create that sense of feeling trapped
Tell
again.
me what to do.
Yeah. Like, what? I can't do this thing? Well, now, now I feel like you're taking my freedom away.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because when we're talking, this is why like the traumas are unique, because for you, safety is being able to get out, in which case a binge is that getting out, right? And for me, the binge is this active voice of standing up for myself and saying, I am here. For someone else, safety might be disappearing, right? So safety, that original trauma might have been something around, I am in a space of physical unsafety or sexual unsafety where being present, being seen is not, and so food becomes either in one of two ways. Well, I'm sure it's more than that, but where a binge can be, I'm hiding in it, I'm covering myself up with it. It's a cocoon versus this active sense of actively pursuing it. And that's why I think it feels different in that sometimes binging, we'll hear people talking about binging as like, I just sort of check out, I numb out, and then I wake up and I've just binged and I don't even know what's happened. I think that's more of that cocooning versus, oh no, I've watched myself binge. I know every moment of it. I've been well aware because it's more active. But it's like what safety is. For me, I don't want to be unseen. That is not safe. For someone else, being seen is so it's like, that's, I think, how this shows up so differently for people, or restriction, where the smaller we make ourselves, the less room we take up, the less people might see us. Right? There's so much of this, like, of different angles going into this, and where food intersects with this, because number one, food is a value system in our culture, so it's a good expression because people notice it. So is our body. So I think it becomes such a tool to express trauma because it means something. And number two, it also has that sensory component. So it also stands in for that bit.
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode.
Can I read you just a couple of paragraphs from an interview with Gabor Mate, and just kind of getting your response to this when he's talking about trauma? Because it spoke to me and I thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
So Gabor says, the essence of trauma is disconnection from ourselves. Trauma is not terrible things that happen from the other side. Those are traumatic. But the trauma is that the very separation from the body and emotions. So the real question is, how did we get separated and how do we reconnect? Because that's our true nature. Our true nature is to be connected. In fact, if that wasn't our true nature, there would be no human beings. The human species, or any species, could not evolve without being grounded in their bodies. You couldn't have a bunch of intellectuals walking around out there in the wild, wondering in an abstract sense about the meaning of life when there's a saber-toothed tiger lurking behind the next bush. It's not an automatic outcome of living in the world that we should become disconnected. It's a product of a certain way of life and a certain way of parenting and certain childhood experiences where it becomes too painful to stay connected, so disconnection becomes a defense.
Yep. Yeah. Disconnection becomes the safety.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, if we looked at it through that frame, is the work or the healing from trauma merely about connection?
Not merely, but I think it's a very important part of it. I think that's what the safety and I think the relationship, like safety in relationships, right? So we are also born to co-regulate with others. It's part of, I mean, we talk a lot about self-regulation, but I think prerequisite is co-regulation and learning how to find safety in connection with others. And where that's absent, a basic building block of self-regulation is removed. So a component, I think, of healing from trauma is finding and slowly, and I've seen this, it's so delicate. It can be, I mean, trust has to build between two people, whether that's a therapist, um, a friend, a partner, like there's someone who feels safe enough to show those wounds and be like, what do you think of me now? Because now I think that's what I see a lot is like once someone exposes a wound in any way, it's the shame of that because that might have been the perceived source of the disconnection. And so finding someone who sees and stays calm, I think is how we learn how to do that. That's how I learned to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I had an idea of how, so that yeah, I think that's a component of healing. Not the only though, of course, because if that were true.
Well, there's something about, I think, the way I think about it, in not judging the response. If you're judging yourself for being angry, if I'm judging myself for wanting to run away and all the judgments I might layer on what that means, I think often having that validation from others is where it starts for many people, because sometimes it doesn't occur to us that maybe some of the judgments we're judging ourselves for about our reactions are not necessarily true. But if you've been judging yourself for so long and believing that because you're behaving like this, that means that you are fill in the gap about what a terrible person that you are, that I think that part needs to be almost challenged first. Having compassion for the reaction itself, even if your reactions to all the different things you've gone through life, you feel is disproportionate now, because that's the thing, because it's about the past, it's not about here and now. The response doesn't seem rational, it doesn't seem proportionate. And then I think when people judge themselves, then they fall into a shame well.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to get out of one of those when you think you deserve to be sitting in this well of shame,
Yeah.
I think is where we lose people.
Yes, it's not a simple loop to break, right? Like it feeds on itself in a lot of different ways, and there's so much always going on at once, right? It's not just this one thing. It's not just a matter of saying, "Oh, you don't need to feel shame. I don't judge you." It's like, yeah, well, great. I mean, I don't trust you, or like I don't trust anything. So it's a slow build of these layers and layers that never really got constructed in the first place that we're meant, I think, as humans to have, right? The ideal way of being raised is through love and affection and physical touch, safety, and a lot of, if those are the building blocks, right, of our relationship with self. So I think trauma work takes a really long time. And with an eating disorder on top of it, that's its own, they intersect, but they're also separate. And so there's a lot of patients involved in this process. And I think like a team, of people usually to help.
But also, I think when somebody else gives you that feedback and tells you, like, tries to normalize it for you or says to you, it's okay that you respond this way, it doesn't mean this. And in your mind, you can't accept that. In your mind, it's just like, well, they don't know.
Yeah.
And you hear it, but then you hear it again
Yes.
from the same person or someone else. And there are certain things where I know I heard it several times, and then I realized it one day, and all the other kind of, I feel like it doesn't get right in, but I feel like it stays with somebody when you offer them that, and you offer it from a really genuine
Sincere.
place, which I think
Yeah.
for most people it is sincere, because we do tend to find it much easier to have that kind of compassion and care when others are suffering than when we're suffering. When we're suffering, quite often we're thinking, oh, I probably deserve this.
Yeah.
But we rarely think that about anyone else unless we know of some really dreadful things they've done.
Yeah, I think that, again, with the repetition, it's the returning and returning. I think when I work with people, I have some clients who are so disconnected from themselves that what I say or my presence for them is like appreciated on an intellectual level, but I can tell it's not necessarily being taken in. Their trauma is very, very deep. But I still do that. It's like, and I say that. I say, I'm going to keep saying this. I'm going to keep saying this. I'm going to keep saying this. And I do. And I'm like a broken record.
Me
Because,
too.
because at the time, I mean, I've been through that as well, where I have been on the other end and someone's saying it to me enough and they didn't stop. Like they never gave up on that. It does. You're like, at some point, there's some part of you that starts to open itself up to that consistency and like, wait a minute, I need to pay attention to this because it's not something else that's just ephemeral and transitory in my life. Like there's something consistent about this. And I think consistency and safety are together. So yeah, I think there is value in that over time.
Yeah. I think what's key as well is knowing you're not the only one. Because it's not to say that we're all the same, we're all having the same responses. But it can really feel like everybody else is going around, quote unquote, normal, and you've got some kind of trauma psychopathology going on, and maybe you didn't feel like you experienced trauma with a capital T. But I think that the normalization of this, the human experience of this, of how much our pasts trigger reactions that are not about the here and now, that's almost what I think of as a traumatic response, is that the reaction is not, it's not a present reaction in the here and now. It might be triggered by the here and now, but the whole past comes in.
Yes. The emotional memory. Yeah.
And there's so much around, particularly on social media, dieting causes binge eating. Dieting is a trauma. I do think dieting can emotionally, psychologically, physically be a traumatic experience to go through. But I often quote Carlos Grillo, something like that.
Where does the S go?
I'm not quite sure. But he did a bit of research for Yale around whether people with binge eating disorder dieted first or the dieting came after the binge eating started. And it was 98 people, not a massive sample, but 65% had dieted first and 35% hadn't tried to diet before they started regularly binge eating. Now, the average onset, do you know what the average onset is for regular binge eating? Like across everybody who would
like age?
fall into from an age perspective, like
20?
the onset. Oh, you're good at this. 19.4. But yeah. So basically, around 20 years old. For people who dieted first before they started binging, that was actually 24.9. So mid-20s, mean average. But for those who binged before they dieted, the average age was 11.6 years old.
Yeah.
So it starts little.
Yeah.
And I often think that the younger the binge eating starts, the more closely aligned it is with those early relational traumatic wounds.
Yeah. And that's harder. I mean, that's where it's like it's getting wired in so young. There's something the binge eating is going to be really tied to itself for, that was the original sense of safety. That's really hard to untangle.
But there's always hope, right?
No,
Steph?
yes, absolutely. It's harder, and I think it takes longer.
Yeah. And I think even more important, that kind of real sense of treating yourself with care.
Yeah.
And compassion.
Yes.
Because, you know, if people want to recover quicker, do you want to hear my tip for recovering quicker? It's about reducing that judgment. I think if you're not judging yourself, you free up so much energy, so much clarity. I'm not saying that's as
That's
simple as
hard.
just, yeah, I was about to say, it's not as simple as just saying,
Yeah.
I'm not going to judge.
Yeah. Because people have learned that that's safe. And again, I mean, I could talk about safety all day long. I spoke to somebody yesterday who grew up from a very young age, hearing how terrible they were, how gross they were, how stupid they were. This voice became like, all right, this is what love is. You know, this is coming from that family of origin, the impact of that. That's our origin point of what belonging means, belonging to a group,
Mhm.
and what love is.
Yeah. And, I was talking to somebody the other day, not client, and we were talking about food because she knows what I do. And she was saying she's struggled with food all her life for as long as she can remember. And her whole story, assuming this is okay to say, I don't think she listens to the podcast and no one will have a clue who she is. But her whole story was around she was born, her parents had her because to replace a lost child, a child that had died.
Mm.
And she said from as young as she can remember, she had this whole sense that her whole purpose was about being mother's comforter.
Yeah.
That was her role, was about being there and never feeling seen or being comforted. And then food became her way of comforting herself so that she could comfort her mother. She cannot even say, and this is what happens, you can't say how, in explicit terms, how these messages are passed on, but they are. Like kids, they pick them up and they feel it, and it's communicated in so many ways.
Mhm.
So something like that, I mean, there'll be people out there that have all these stories that they'll think, well, my childhood was okay. Why should I be struggling with food? Why should I be feeling the way I do about myself? My parents loved me or provided for me or whatever that might be. But again, it's that the emotional misattunement. And what I'm seeing over and over again, I was chatting with a therapist friend about this the other day, is that it seems what everybody needs is to be heard. That
Yeah.
just seems to be 90% of the work is not
Yeah.
just listening, really hearing somebody out,
Mhm, mhm.
you know.
I think the hope too is that there's more discussion around these things because what you're saying, this stuff is passed on. I also think the intergenerational trauma is passed on, and epigenetics is, I believe in that. Um, so I know that a lot of my stuff, my parents loved me and I felt their love for me. And on the outside, I had a very normal childhood. Um, but my stuff is my dad's stuff. I know. And his stuff is his mom's stuff.
Mhm.
And her like, I can now see that trail. I also see the stuff on my mom's side through my grandma and her mom, for sure, and all that. And so awareness of this so that now I don't pretend to believe that because I'm aware of this, my daughters are good to go, because they're not. And I know that I am leaking some of that over as much as I try, as much as my awareness is there. There's stuff I can't. And so they'll get some, but there is a lot more. I saw this graphic yesterday of different generations, and then there's a shield up that what somebody's holding, but
Mhm.
they're getting saturated a little too, and so does the next generation. But that's how I feel like maybe that this point in time is this. I've got this awareness, and I can't get it all for sure, but there is something there that's like, wait, I don't want to do that. I could see how if I didn't know about this, if I didn't have awareness about this, I would be triggering right onto my daughters every day. It would just be there. I wouldn't be able to help it. But having done a lot of this, I'm like, oh yeah, like that's what that is. Like, don't do that. Don't say this. This isn't hers. This is yours. That stuff is like, all right, hopefully. And then she'll have more of a shield as she goes.
Yeah. I think we live in exciting times for that, where people are really much more. I know there's criticisms about navel gazing or whatever, but that people are willing to really try to understand ourselves. I think people are so deep. I think we have such depths. Everybody does. Places within us that we can't even get to. But to be just even going through some of those layers and having, I know, information and people talking about it that enables you to then think, oh, right, like having that resonance helps us realize things about ourselves as well. what I really love about when you're talking about that is that you're acknowledging that there are always going to be things that you're not aware of.
Mm.
I see this a lot in the therapist community. People who just think that they're so self-aware. They go on and on about their self-awareness. And I just think the minute you think you're self-aware, you're not. Like literally, I would be the first to say, like, I am so unself-aware, and so I don't know what I don't know, but I know there's a shed load of stuff I don't know about myself and why I do things, and I have billions of blind spots, no doubt. I'm just trying to uncover them one at a time, and it will never be a task that's finished.
Yeah. It's like self-awareness is being aware that you don't have it.
Yeah. I sometimes go in that loop. I do, Steph, I do the exact loop where I'm like, I'm not very self-aware. And I'm like, but that makes me really self-aware. Oh, no,
But
I'm not.
that-
No, I'm not self-aware anymore. Oh, but now I can go down.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying this conversation so much, but we are coming to an end. But I really did enjoy that one.
Yeah. Hopefully it's been helpful. And if there's any questions or places to expand, please let us know. You can always write us at lifeafterdietspodcast@gmail.com. Is it podcast or is it? I can't remember.
lifeafterdietspodcast@gmail.com.
No.
Yeah. And even if you just want to just share your story a bit, if you just want to write your story and share it with us, we'll read it and hear it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Alrighty then.
Okay. That was a big sigh again. Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you, Steph. Thank you for those of you that stayed with us.
See you next week.
Bye.